Bad things do happen. In one way or another, all of us are living on the edge right now. It's easy to draw up a list of things to fear, things that might go wrong, things that challenge our sense of justice and what is right. Speaking of things going wrong, we live in a country where it's still a virtual coin toss as to whether Donald Trump will be our next president. As an aside here, regarding the separation of church and state, I am allowed to disparage a candidate from this pulpit, and I am allowed to praise a candidate from this pulpit. What I can't do, and we can't do as a church, is make support of a particular candidate a condition of participation in this church. But we're all allowed to have opinions. There is so much going on with the red versus blue split in America today, and the attraction of so many of our fellow citizens to authoritarian leadership. I could try to get analytic about this, but I'm tired and you don't want to hear it anyway. What I can observe is that this split is mostly not rooted in issues or ideas. If it were, we could debate over the issues and the ideas. The split is rooted instead in the gut and in the heart. Whether you fundamentally have fear over what might be threatened or lost in the near future, or alternatively, whether you are hopeful for what might be gained by reform and change. Voters have their agendas, and candidates must play to the interests of those constituents. What befuddles me is the amount of work that legislators, given this situation, at the federal and state levels, the amount of work they're putting into things that are not on the list of things that voters truly care most about. Those are things like the economy, immigration, healthcare. Anyhow, sometimes we've allowed our political system to pack legislatures with cultural conservatives. Cultural conservatives, in my lexicon, is just a pretty nice way of saying fundamentalist Christian crazies. And this is where I do see the separation of church and state as a big problem. I have no issue with people deciding to make their own theological choices. We each have a First Amendment right to overlook rationality and common sense. And some would say you exercise that right by becoming a UU. But we do not have the right to transpose our religious doctrines into law and then impose them on everyone else. It's bad enough that God appears on our money and in our Pledge of Allegiance. I've always wondered which God is on the tenor that my Hindu neighbor spends on lottery tickets. Or if it's okay to say, one nation under Allah, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And is it nuts? It is nuts, not is it nuts. It is nuts that a prominent display of the Ten Commandments is being required in all Louisiana classrooms. There's a whole lot of malarkey going on out there, to quote a friend of mine. I want to see the curriculum that explains adultery to young school kids, or that explains, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything else that is thy neighbor's. I wonder how they deal with that in Louisiana. That's the King James Version as I read it. By far the largest issue where religion and law have crossed lately involves reproduction, childbirth, and abortion. The reversal of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court is its own abomination, again, primarily driven by religious beliefs or by pandering to religious beliefs. I do have sympathy for most of the so-called pro-life movement, in that I believe that many of the people on that side of the issue are sincere and hold a true sense of moral despair. They should be able to voice their opinion. But this is an issue where the government has to say, your moral judgments are mostly religious in nature, and we can't ask all Americans to comply with them. That would be unconstitutional. And then anything related to sex and gender invites us to get on the slippery slope towards religious imposition. And in my ever so tolerant way of speaking, invites the Christian crazies into the room. Abortion, birth control, and in vitro fertilization, these have all become legislative hockey pucks, generating proposed laws like crazy. But let's get a little away from politics and start turning back towards Kate here and her very powerful message, but it'll take me a minute to get there. And acknowledge that most treatment of anything related to gender nonconformity is being handled terribly in our society as a rule. A lot of culture change has happened over a very short time in this arena. It was only 50 years ago that the issue of homosexuality exploded into our newspapers with the uprisings that followed the police raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York City. This was one of the first times that anything gay was discussed in other than a whisper. The idea of pride started growing quickly thereafter, but it faced much ridicule, resistance, and derision. However, things did keep changing. The criminalization of same-sex intercourse was fully eliminated by 2003. Same-sex marriages became legal nationally in 2015, years after many states had started doing it on their own. I have always garnered great hope from observing this huge turnaround in the LGBT community in just over a generation's time. It's a reminder that change is possible, culturally and legally. That's not to say that everything is perfect today. We know that there's much residual prejudice and anger towards the gay rights agenda and discrimination towards and of gay persons. But by and large, the lesbian, gay, and bisexual population is now fairly mainstream in American life. I mean, heck, half of our TV shows are centered on a gay couple, or so it seems. Issues surrounding gender are still quite unsettling to many persons, though, and remain quite unsettled in law. When we start getting into gender definition issues, I'm not really knowledgeable, and I don't want to pretend that I am. On issues regarding gender, biology, medicine, and law, I have much more to learn. And I might say some things inappropriately this morning, and if I do, I apologize up front for that. What I do know and accept is that gender is not as simple as male or female. And that gender alone does not determine sexual preference. Gender identity is the gender a person identifies themselves as being, as opposed to their gender assigned at birth. Persons who transition to fulfill a gender identity that is different from their assigned gender are termed transgender. And transitioning most often involves hormone therapy to help the body conform to the new identity, and may or may not involve gender-affirming surgery. And the one thing I truly know about all of this is that the medical choices people make are private, that it's always rude to ask, they'll share if they want to. Persons with gender dysphoria face a very difficult and turbulent life process. From the moment of birth forward, our society is strongly gendered. We hold very different expectations of boys and girls. We treat them differently. And kudos to the parents who minimize the extent to which they do this. Because there's no test or measure of gender identity in a child, it's a process of self-discovery. And in the case of gender conflict, there is usually no one to tell a child that they have an option. Instead, the child grows up in a world where they feel increasingly uncomfortable and wrong. And even as the child starts to figure things out, there's a very good chance that they will find resistance all around them, often among those they love and rely on most. Hopefully, our sensitivities will change, but it's a very fortunate trans child who finds immediate support among friends or family. As a result, transgender children manifest many psychological problems, including anxiety, depression, sadness, negative self-image. And life generates other real pressures. Trans kids are far more likely to think about or attempt suicide than other children or youth. And the stated reasons usually involve something like emotional neglect by their family, school belonging issues, and self-stigma. And all of these are exacerbated by discrimination, bullying, and transphobia, all of which are common in their lives. Unfortunately, transgendered persons are not just more likely to harm themselves, they're more likely to be targets of violence, including murder. Homicides are common enough that we now hold an annual Transgender Day of Remembrance to honor the victims of transphobic violence. Now I'm going to get out of the weeds here a little. I started this all by saying, so, bad things do happen. Well, sometimes they happen to all of us at once, and sometimes just to one of us at a time. We all know about the bad things we share. These are things like the Dobbs decision, Trump winning in 2016, or the current White Sox season. Other times we have to carry the load for bad things all alone, or with close friends if we are lucky. That is because these are things that happen to us alone. And we all know how lonely it can be when bad things happen to you. You might feel pain, anger, frustration, sorrow, all of which are uncomfortable and isolating. I won't try to comment on all of the changes Kate went through in her process of self-discovery and transition. There's a lot of pain in her story and a lot of persistence and perseverance as well. But focusing on the one situation where her health benefits were denied, we can all agree that the situation was very lousy and that she must have felt totally betrayed after having made such progress in bringing her life together. And it was a personal problem. It was something done to her, and it to really mess her life up. I imagine she did feel truly alone and powerless for a while. Except eventually she wasn't alone and powerless. Any one thing that could be unjustly done to her could also be done unjustly to others. So she found the strength in herself to try to take a next step, to challenge the unfair decisions made by her employer and an insurance company. She found an ally in the ACLU, and after a few years, and I'm sure many tears, they turned her loss into a precedent-setting legal victory that will benefit many who follow behind her. We don't always win, but it must feel good to fight for the good fight for a just cause. And I can guarantee that Kate found fulfillment in her victory. But even if the decisions had gone the wrong way, she still did the right thing, the just thing. And I have to believe that even if her case had ended in failure, it would have somehow started change and led to things happening in the future that were different than the way they were. We all need to get busy because the world needs our energy, our commitment, and our will to do good. And if nothing else, as we heard several times this morning, there is an election coming up that we really do care about. I will close with a piece from the historian Howard Zinn. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of present times. And to live now as we think a human being should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Amen. Blessed be Ashe. Next, we will sing